The Aureus Alexander longsword. Is this the sword you've been looking for? Hello and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. I'm Michael Thomas, and today I'm going to be taking a look at this rather fancy training longsword from Aureus. It's called the Aureus Alexander. Now, this particular sword I've owned for a couple of years. I've used it for all kinds of sparring, and more importantly, and I think this is of more interest to most people, I've actually used this as my kind of personal sword and given it a really good long-term test. So this isn't after sort of maybe 10 or 20 fights. I've used this almost every week for the last couple of years that I've had it. So it's been used against longswords, mesas, dusaks, against mixed weapons, melee, all kinds of sparring. So it's had a really good test. It's had a good beating, and as you can see, the rack needs to be re-glued. I got the sword out to do the video and just noticed that once again it's come undone. But you get to see the sword, warts and all. So I will post a link to the actual sword so you can check the specifications and prices, because when I bought this, it was so long ago, well, not that long ago, but a few years ago. The prices have almost certainly gone up by now, and I'm assuming they even make the same model sword. This was just called the Aureus Alexander when I bought it. Now, many people have gone for the Aureus swords because they've heard about that they're really good sort of tournament swords. They're kind of fast, flexible, nice and safe. Even if the design is sort of, well, it's okay. And it's not the most exciting sword to look at, but then it is just a basic training longsword. Nonetheless, lengthwise, this is their kind of standard model. It's comparable to pretty much all the other feathers out there. But the one thing you notice very early on though is the flex is very good. It's very stiff in the strong, so there's very little. You've got to really push it to get any kind of flex in the strong of the blade, but a really nice flex in the tip. And when I've stabbed people, of which I've stabbed many people with this longsword, you get that really nice flex in the weak. So you make it sort of as safe as is humanly possible, and with a nice, let's have a look if you can see that. Come on, focus. There we go. So you can see you've got a nice kind of spatulated tip, which you can put an additional sort of rubber tip or something, or leather tip over the top of, but you do get quite a fat, quite a wide, and sort of slightly sort of flared out tip stock. So that's quite nice. Not all the longswords come with such a decent tip, so that's pretty impressive. You've got a number of different types of crossguard you can choose from. This was just the standard one that I ordered. It's quite crude, to be honest. If you look at it, that looks like something that was laser cut or just ground into shape. And it's very flat. There's no detailing on it. But as a training tool, it doesn't really matter. Standard wrap on the grip, which, as anybody knows, if you've got any kind of wrap on a grip, the minute you start taking hits, or your gloves, if you're using shell mittens or something and it's got the edges maybe are rubbing, eventually you get sort of marks, tears, and then the thread starts to unravel. So I've glued this and redone it several times, and it needs to be done again. It's a bit of a pain in the backside, but you know. What are the other options? You can glue leather straight flat onto it, but it doesn't really matter. Pommel, nice smooth sort of pear-shaped pommel, and mine has a tiny bit of movement in it now, which I'm not quite sure where the movement is, because it appears that this particular sword is peened. So there's not really much I can do about that. It doesn't translate down to the rest of the sword though, so there's just this tiny bit of movement, which I'm keeping an eye on just to make sure nothing else happens. But you know, maybe with this re-wrapped and put in a bit tighter, maybe it'll hold a bit tighter, who knows. But anyway, Aureus Alexander, what's it like to actually spar with? Well, my first impression was actually quite negative. I found the sword, it felt a little artificial in the hand. So if I look at, say, a black fencer training longsword, it feels like a blunt longsword in the hand, so really strong in the bind, maybe a little bit slower. This kind of feels like, if you think what an épée is like, as a kind of a sportive weapon, this felt more like sort of an épée built into a longsword. In that you've got sort of maximum flexibility where you need it. You've got a blade that's surprisingly fast and nimble, and an overall sword that actually feels quite light in the hand. So in many ways it feels more like sort of, your classic feather as opposed to a longsword. Which, I appreciate it is built as a feather, but you might be looking for some kind of middle ground. So my first impression was, I wasn't sort of super impressed. It was kind of nice to fight with. But then I went and used my other swords. I went to my Darkword, Albions, Black Fencer, and they've all got pros and cons. But I keep coming back to this one because it's kind of, if it had a list of stats in a video game, it would sort of be higher on almost every one of the stats, sort of mobility, speed, stiffness on the blade, safety, cutting and thrusting. Everything about it just seems pretty good. It's weird. So, you think first impression, so I'm not quite sure. But long term, out of all the swords I have in my bag, this is the one that comes out every single week to be used. So I suppose that's the most telling thing with a sword, is how often do you use it? And I have other long swords that just never get used. In fact, some of them haven't been used for over a year, whereas this one gets used all the time. So as I said, I'll put the details on the description for the actual sword on the website, so you can check it out. Go and check the spec. They do a number of other models, and they have some with the old, rain guard or whatever you want to call it down here. That wasn't available when I bought mine. I wasn't really too bothered one way or the other. And they do other models. They do a shorter one, a super light one that feels, well, almost like it's hollow. And that is one of the things that I found with this when I first got it, is that the blade feels like there's sort of, like there's a channel with air inside it. It's sort of, the actual blade feels lighter than it actually should. It's very hard to kind of put into words, because you look at it and it's just not my lights. It's a surprisingly thick blade and strong, and even halfway down, it's a meaty blade, and yet when you're sparring with it, it feels like quite a thin feather blade. So I don't know what they've done to it, but the end result is you end up with something that is very controllable, handles extremely well in the bind, and is safe in the thrust. So, and if I had to give it sort of a mark, a rating out of 10, I'd probably give it a good 8, maybe even a 9 out of 10. It's pretty much a perfect longsword, even though my first impressions weren't super positive. So it just goes to show, once you actually start using it, you find out whether you like it or not. So this is the Aureus Alexander. I'll post in the details. Any questions about it, other than how am I going to glue this back on, just pop them in the comment section, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks again for watching.